Hi, I'm Mike Duran.
And I'm Marshall Kozlov.
Welcome to Counterbalance. Our guest this week is Miles Yu. He's our colleague here at the Hudson Institute, but he's also a professor of history, of naval and military history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. In addition, he worked in the policy planning staff in the Trump State Department, working for our colleague, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, advising him on China matters.
What I really appreciated about speaking with Dr. Yu is the fact that he clearly is a strategic thinker. On this podcast and other podcasts, you're going to hear folks talk about their policy priorities. They're going to talk about a situation in world affairs from an analytical perspective, but I appreciated how Dr. Yu is able to combine a strategic approach with the clear fact that he's a professor, and then also combine that with his government experience to come up with the picture he's bringing.
I totally agree. I mean, he's got the triple whammy. He knows his history. He knows the culture of China, and he's a strategic thinker. Let's say the quadruple whammy, because he's also worked in government. I think that's a real added plus. Very few people, I think, combine all four of those areas. Deep area knowledge. People who have deep area expertise often can't see the world from the point of view of Washington and what Washington should do, because they're so steeped in the culture and understanding of the locality. I think he can bridge all of those areas and brings it together in a very, very wise way. Really enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, I think we've gotten to the show don't tell part of the introduction. So with no further ado, here's our conversation with Dr. Miles Yu, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, and a huge thank you, of course, to Hudson Institute for supporting our work.
Miles Yu, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, expert on China, and former official in the Policy Planning Office at the State Department. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, glad to be with you, Mike, and I thank you for the opportunity for me to share my thoughts with you.
Thanks for coming.
Sorry about that, Marshall. Miles, thing I like about you is that in addition to knowing an enormous amount about China and about Chinese-American relations, you also have a strategic brain, which is kind of rare actually in among area studies people, I think. So I'd like to take maximum advantage of that and just give you really quickly some rapid fire questions about strategy, and then we'll dig into it after that. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so here are the rapid fire questions. Number one, what is the nature of the U.S.-Chinese conflict? What are we fighting about?
The U.S.-China competition, shall we use that phrase for now, is really about the future of the free world. This not as many historians have hypothesized that is some kind of a Thucydides trap. In other words, it's a old traditional power is in decline and feel uncomfortable with the rising new challenger. It's not about that. The nature of the U.S.-China competition is really about China versus the rest of the free world.
Wow.
Because it really deals with the competition of two extremely incompatible models of governance. The Chinese model, which is now vigorously exporting to the rest of the world, is really about a large government controlling major aspect of economic, political, and social activities of all the people living within that system.
Okay, let's stop there because these are going to be rapid fire questions. So with that, you just gave us a ton to talk about. But let me run you through the rapid fire ones first,
great,
and then we'll unpack these. Okay.
Sure.
So question number 2: What does victory for the United States look like?
Victory for the United States means that we maintain and strengthen the existing system since the end of World War II that is established by the free will of the people and led by the United States and the Western world. And also, I think, it's the system that has spread to the rest of the world, particularly in Asia. China is the odd man out in that region. So I think if you look at Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, and everywhere, the trend of democracy is unstoppable. China is trying to stop that and to overcome that trend. And I think that's the victory for the United States. If we can hold the Chinese expansion, hold the Chinese expansion of its model of governance to the rest of the world, and that's basically the major victory for the United States.
Does that definition of victory require regime change in China, or can it be achieved through containment?
The issue right now is not whether we can change or should change the regime. The issue right now, as I said earlier, is whether the regime will change all of us. And the answer is yes, because China, enabled by its powerful economy and its powerful advance in technologies, it has not only the intention, but also the capabilities to do so. So that's why I think, it's really not up to the United States alone to change the regime. And I think we have to really force the regime to change its behavior and to make the people of China to make their own decision. And I would just stop right there.
Okay, last rapid fire question. Are we, by your estimation, are we winning or losing this competition?
I think we are winning in a very subterranean way. If you go beyond the temporary distress caused by COVID, and the United States has enormous reputational and a real power strength. Reputational because if you look at China, the Chinese Communist Party fears most. What makes Chinese Communist Party fear most is really its own people embracing the Western model of democracy represented by the United States. That's why they spend enormous effort to discredit the US system. Even that, the US system is extremely appealing to the people of China. So in that way, we are winning, not because what we say, what we do, but because of who we are and what United States stands for, number one. Number two, in terms of real strength, militarily, economically, United States is indisputably the leader of the world. Our military is much stronger than China, despite China's recent rapid development of its weapon platforms and its overall military strength. So we still have this leading edge in many, many key aspects of the warfare. So I remain very optimistic, and we are winning. And it also, China has one very big problem as well. That is, China has really no allies. United States international alliance is strong. It suffers some setbacks, but it's getting stronger and stronger, particularly toward the end of the Trump administration's time. And you see our allies globally rally around, and we share much more common understanding of the nature of the China challenge. And that is a very, very important sign. And even NATO was talking about expanding its military involvement in Asia Pacific. And I call that a good, big victory.
There's so much there, Miles, that I want to start bringing in questions about what you said. So let's start here. When you say the US and the Chinese systems are incompatible, what exactly does that mean? Because obviously a topic of conversation during the post-2016 policy space was there are a lot of people on the American right and left who believe that to a certain degree the US needs to focus inwards. What is happening in the Asia Pacific or the Middle East doesn't matter. No one really sees China attempting to invade the US. So how exactly does incompatibility work in that context, right? Because someone could obviously say, let the Chinese have their own system, let the Americans have our own system. What do you say to those folks?
Well, yes, the two systems, the Chinese can always say, well, the two systems can coexist. It cannot. Just thinking about American business in China, much of the success of the free capitalist system is based upon free flow of information, transparency of transactions. And the Chinese government operates the economy that is the exactly opposite. It stifles free flow of information. Many of its economic data, key vital signs, were fake or inadequate. So the Chinese Communist Party decides the major index of its economic pulse, including its currency value. So that's not a free capitalist system. It's very harmful to the United States if we keep going that track. On the ideological level, the Chinese communist system basically represented the model of surveillance, of repression, of abysmal human rights violations, and the United States is opposite that. We also champion diversity of opinions in a philosophical way. The Chinese system demands unanimity in opinion. So in a way, this is really existential. So when we say China challenge is existential, which basically means if the Chinese model prevails, our model will perish. So that as simple as that.
And just one more follow-up on this. I was also interested in your language about the free world versus China. Could you define the free world? Because if you think about these conflict points, you think of Vietnam, for example, not a country that anyone would describe as being remotely democratic or even capitalistic in the Western sense. China and Vietnam have their own regional rivalries, which come into broader conversations about the US's role in the region. So how do you define the quote unquote teams and the different perspectives that are at play?
That's a very good point. Now, when I use the word free world, I basically means the international system established after World War II with basic principles endorsed by the people that basically include some of the general government philosophies, including the limited government, consent of the people, and freedom of expression, freedom of speech, those things, freedom of religion. There are also other countries that do not share that those ideals, like what you mentioned in Vietnam. However, they are the enemies of the Chinese Communist state for geopolitical reasons. So there is a larger community, which is what we mostly may refer to as a free world. And there is a community on the fringe who do not share the major principles with us on governance. However, they do share the common understanding of the China threat to their own national security. Those countries, we can form alliance of convenience and expediency based upon what we face jointly. That is China challenge. Now, of course, we also have the confidence in ourselves. We had the confidence in ourselves from very beginning. I mentioned this idea of a free world. You know, when NATO was first established in 1949, we included undemocratic countries, some outright dictatorships, into the NATO alliance, including Spain, Portugal, and Turkey at the time. So gradually, within the larger community of free world, those countries evolve. So hopefully, you see the same pattern. You saw the same pattern in Asia as well. When we led this this Cold War in the Asia Pacific area, we transformed Japan into a democracy, and gradually, while we collaborated with the dictatorships like the Philippines and the Taiwan and South Korea, one by one, those countries, by engaging with the US-led democratic alliance, transform themselves into democracies. So hopefully, when we engage with Vietnam, Vietnamese people will probably see the same kind of a path and will fall into that kind of pattern of history. So that's why I loosely refer to the free world, but it's not completely exclusively meaning every member in that community has to be sharing the same level of democracy and freedom.
I couldn't agree with that more. In fact, I'd like to add a little footnote onto what you said. I recently read Dean Acheson's memoirs of, From the Creation, and he made a point that when they were Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State for Truman, and he made the point that when they were putting together the Cold War strategy, they sat to think about carefully what were the attributes of the United States and what were the essential attributes and goals of the United States and the attributes and goals of the Soviet Union. And they said that the big difference was that the Soviet Union demanded that everyone in its system follow the exact same doctrines and have the exact same kind of regimes. They imposed an orthodoxy and a conformity throughout their whole system, and that our system, all we demanded of people in our system was that they work with us to defeat the enemy of our system, not that they necessarily all have exactly the same attributes. I think that's the strategy, or that's the kind of strategic mindset that won the Cold War, and we have forgotten that now. And there's a kind of post-Reagan idea that what the United States did was simply promote democracy everywhere, and that's what defeated the Soviet Union. Democracy promotion was part of it, but there was this larger idea of a heterogeneous community. And I think that that's really important that we get back to that, because I come to that looking at it from the point of view of the Middle East, where I don't think a lot of the countries that are our allies are going to become democracies. And I think if we went and tried to push them to become democracies, we're going to have more problems on our hands and weaken ourselves. But anyway, that's my little editorial comment. Let me ask you about a specific country, because I think I've listened to you many, many times and paid very close attention to your thinking. And there's an issue on which I think we have possibly a slight disagreement, and that's the potential of the United States to detach Russia, or to make common cause with Russia in opposing China. And it's my view that we should actually think of the Chinese threat as a threat from China, but also China's alignment. I wouldn't say alliance, but say alignment with Russia and Iran. And so, can we get your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. One of the hallmarks of the Trump administration diplomatic triumph, I use that word emphatically, is to reprioritize America's national security agenda. One of the most important aspects of that is to rebalance the threat level of Russia and China, North Korea, and Iran. So those were the four countries specifically mentioned in the December 2017 national security strategy. Now, national security challenges are many aspects, but we have to prioritize. We have to figure out which challenge is much more substantial, which one is secondary. So the overwhelming preponderant conclusion by all administration agencies, by the president, by Secretary of State, by Secretary of Defense, is China is the number one. Russia is secondary. Now, to say that runs great political risk, because the topic of Russia is very toxic in American politics. There is a vested interest in American defense and the intelligence community that would perpetually treat Russia as the number one threat to the American system. And we were also, that misperception was also further strengthened by our NATO allies, because NATO was created to face one particular threat, that is from the Soviet Union. And now they try to exaggerate the degree to which Russia was an existential threat to European community. Now, I'm not saying Russia is not a threat. What I'm saying is Russia is not an existential threat, not nearly to the level of the Chinese threat. because Russia, number one, has lost its ideological impetus to expand. It may have a narrow nationalistic impulse in Ukraine, other places, but does not have this old communist style impulse to conquer the world. Number two, Russia's capability is far limited than before and far less capable than the Chinese capability. Russia's economy is about 1/8 of the Chinese economy. Russia's defense spending is about 1/3 of China's. And Russia's technological advance is not nearly as obvious as the Chinese. The Chinese control some of the leading technologies in space, in cyber, in deep sea. Russia has one obvious advantage, that is the nuclear arsenal. But the impetus for a global nuclear Armageddon between Russia and the United States or the entire West is almost none. So in that regard, I think Russia is striving for global relevance. China is really striving for global dominance. And we, in the Trump administration, made that very clear. Despite constant spin, otherwise, always the countries always try to say Russia, Russia, Russia. Russia is a bad actor in many aspects, but China is really existential to us. So
okay, I'm in total, absolute, 100% agreement with you on everything you said, but I'm trying to find a little bit of disagreement here. So let me ask a follow-up there. There is a view that because of all the things that you said, we can actually turn Russia, if not into an ally of ours in containing China, we can come to an accommodation with them to help contain China. And I've come to the view, when looking at Russia from the point of view of the Middle East, that that Russia is, because of the disparities in power between between Beijing and Moscow that you very succinctly elaborated there, Russia actually can't afford to get too far out of sync with the Chinese. And for practical purposes, we should, in almost every area except possibly Central Asia, we should be seeing Russia as in an alignment with China. And so that's my question.
Okay, so there you found a little bit of a disagreement with me. Yes, we cannot be Pollyannic about the forging some kind of anti-China alliance with Russia. Russia and China share many things. You can see on international stage in Russia and China normally vote the same way. And when it comes to Syria, North Korea, and many other situations. So they're in cahoots in many aspects. But fundamentally, Russia and China share some major differences there. Russia is concerned about China just as many of China's neighbors are concerned about China, because Russia considers its Far East as very important, as its strategic rear. And because of strategic rear, you have to cover its rear. So therefore, Russia has to play the China card. Now, Russia's strategy so far has been pretty smart, in my view. That is to keep China very close in its rank, but not close enough to prevent Russia from developing its own other allies in the region that were normally against China. For example, Russia's traditional friends in Vietnam. And Russia also has a very strong diplomatic impulse to be close with Japan. And Japan has no hard feeling lost, no good feeling lost between Tokyo and Beijing. So I think that Russia has played a very skillfully executed balance of diplomacy when it comes to China. Now, Russia also is concerned about China's role in some of its regional alliance, particularly the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, the SCO. Initially, despite its name, Shanghai, Russia was supposed to play a very important role, leading role there. Gradually, China took over. So now China, is basically controlling all the stands who Russia considers as the former allies. So Russia feels very uncomfortable with that. So I would say, yes, Russia and China have some common ground in dealing with the international situation. But fundamentally, there are very major differences over there. And I think we should be very cognizant of that. Whether we should that as a wedge or not, that's up to the diplomacy people to do that. But I think as strategists, as think tank policy advisors, we should definitely be aware of those fundamental differences between Russia and China. And also, to give Russia credit, China has been courting Russia to forge some kind of military alliance in Eastern China Sea, in South China Sea. Russia has steadfastly refused to do so. And it's very clear because Russia wants to sell weapons to some of its traditional allies in the region, India, Vietnam, and now Indonesia. So Russia has many friends in the region, not just Chinese. China wants to have some kind of exclusive relationship with Moscow. Moscow wants to be promiscuous, and that's their right. And I think they're doing it for its own good. And I think that's something that we also should pay attention to.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
I have one last question on Russia. I was interested in your point or your characterization of Russian expansionism as a communistic feature, but as I'm thinking back to my knowledge of Russian history, I'm thinking of the Great Game with Britain in the 1800s, Russo-Japanese War, various wars with Turkey. Expansionism was a feature of Russia outside of the communistic context. So I'm just curious if you could clarify that a little bit.
Okay, so that actually is an excellent question. Thank you very much, Marshall, for asking that. Even at the time in the late 1940s, after the end of World War II, Russia, the Soviet Union, shall we say, went out to be very aggressive in some of the countries, particularly Eastern European countries. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. Those countries went democratic and they elected national leaders. And Soviet Union went on to basically sabotage them. And the last one was Czechoslovakia in 1948. So at the time, the Soviet Union had its own theory, said, we want to establish some kind of buffer zone to protect our national security, to prevent another, Nazi invasion from the West. So this is the legitimate. So therefore, we have to conquer. We have to basically to control the Eastern European landmass. Many people in the West bought that theory, including some of the very prominent thinkers in the West, like Walt Lippmann, for example, the famous columnist. That was the illusion. That was the pretext. The person who convincingly argued otherwise was George Kennan. George Kennan wrote a secret table to the State Department in 1946, and then a year later, he published an article. This is a famous X article, Mr. X article, in which he argued the primary impetus for the Soviet conquest globally was not a nationalistic impulse. It was a Marxist, Leninist ideology. Because according to that Marxist Leninist theory, the entire capitalist system is trying its best to devour, to destroy, to bury socialist country, particularly the first socialist country, the Soviet Union. Therefore, for self-defense, you must go out to destroy the entire international capitalist system. It's the matter of survival. So you have to do it. Otherwise, you'll be dead. There is actually a Chinese phrase for that. It's called 你死我活, you die, I live, which is still practiced right now, which is predominant thinking of Chinese Communist Party today. So that's why the Soviet expansionism in the since late 1940s was predominantly guided by a ideological thinking that sort of sipped through the Soviet strategic thinking. And I'll just stop right there to answer your question.
No, that's really helpful. So I want to take us to the broader context that we're having this conversation. We're focusing on China's place in Asia Pacific, China's place in the Eurasian landmass. A big effort that anyone who follows this issue would be aware of is the rhetoric around Belt and Road, China's effort to expand its footprint, especially within Asia. Can you just give us an update on the status of the Belt and Road Initiative, and then also your strategic perspective on the issue?
Okay, Belt and Road actually is a very interesting idea. It started out as a what China calls self-defense strategy. That is, China believed that the Americans and Europeans dominated the major global commons in the Middle East, in the Pacific in particular. So there was a vast area of what China considered as a vacuum of influence the U.S. didn't pay much attention to. That is the Central Asia region and Africa, that remote area U.S. didn't pay much attention to. So that's where the original intention of Belt and Roads, so then they go to Central Asia, and then there's a maritime Silk Road along the Indian Ocean and all the way to Africa. And gradually, when Xi Jinping started that, and he realized, you know what, with the help of global international trade status China fully enjoyed, with the globalizing technologies such as 5G, such as cyber, such as space, China can actually do much bigger. So Belt and Road became a global initiative to expand from those two regions I mentioned earlier to the heart of Europe, to Central America, become a global initiative. And that's where China's global ambition comes in. So Belt and Road itself is actually a pretext for China's global expansion of its own economic might. And the whole purpose of that is to create global dependency on the Chinese governance. Started with the economy, and then technology, and then you name it, there is also the combination of political control. And then gradually you see the slipping away of national sovereignty by many of the countries within the Belt and Road scheme. And I think a lot of people are beginning to worry about that. So that's where that's what my take of the Belt and Road is.
When you look at the Chinese people, you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you think we kind of have a tacit ally in our competition with China, in the aspirations of the Chinese people. To what extent do they share the ideological commitment of the Communist Party, and to what extent does that even matter?
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you, Mike, for asking that. Overwhelming majority of the Chinese people really do not care about Chinese communist ideology. They are enthusiastic in pursuit of happiness, by which I mean in pursuit of material accumulation. All the major bourgeois status symbols of life as we are so familiar in the West. So their daily routine do not center on communist ideology. That reality itself scared the Chinese Communist Party leadership. So the Communist Party leadership, particularly under Xi Jinping, who is the ideologue, who has a doctorate in scientific socialism, by the way, who's imposed upon the nation indoctrination of communist ideology virtually at every level, from kindergarten, primary school, all the way to graduate school, and then every aspect of the national structure, including foreign investment companies, foreign companies. So they insisted there must be Chinese Communist Party sales within those companies, and everybody has to study Xi Jinping thoughts. And if you are ethnic minorities, you have to abandon your cultural and religious thoughts and to study communism and Xi Jinping thoughts. If you refuse, they lock you up in the camps. That's what happened to the Uyghurs. We say there's up to 1 million people, more than 1 million people locked up in the concentration camp in Xinjiang. Well, they're not primarily a labor camp. They're primarily indoctrination camp. They train them, they force them to study party directives, Marxist-Leninist theories, and Xi Jinping thoughts. And so this is basically the reality in China. There is the capitalistic population who care nothing about the communist ideology, and there is a ideologically intoxicated Chinese Communist Party leadership who controls all powers in China and who basically impose all this communist indoctrination to the people. So I see a seismic conflict over there. The reason why we don't know much about it is because the control mechanism in China is total totalitarian. We don't have much of access to what's really going on there. The journalists were kicked out. Chinese surveillance system is superb in terms of its efficiency. So that sheer reality is very important for the policymakers to understand. That's why one of the most important statements, one of the most important realization of the Trump administration, particularly articulated by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, is that the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese people are not the same. That is so crucial for us to realize when we make our national policy.
So can we speak about Hong Kong and by attachment Taiwan? Because obviously the Chinese Communist Party's conception of what the Chinese people are is expansive, and that's where a lot of these debates come into play.
Well, let's talk about Hong Kong. Hong Kong and Taiwan in the Chinese strategic thinking belong to the same basket. That is the area and the people that China wants to, they call the reunited. And Hong Kong obviously had 150 years out of British colonial rule. Taiwan has never been part of the People's Republic of China. It's a de facto independent entity run by a democratically elected national leader. So the essence of Hong Kong is basically Hong Kong enjoys the free market system, number one. Hong Kong maintained, as China promised in 1984 with the British, a certain degree of autonomy. That would include free speech, independent judicial system. And China negated that promise, and since last year, China basically took over. And they turned a freewheeling society into just another province of China. And so it's fully integrated into the Chinese system. No more freedom of expression, no more judicial independence, and everything fall into the national security control. And that's the tragedy of Hong Kong. So with the fall of Hong Kong is the whole idea of the Chinese overall formula for so-called national unification of Hong Kong and Taiwan. That is the one country, two systems formula. One country, that means Chinese Communist Party has to be in control. Two systems means for those two specific regions, there ought to be some kind of a separated social and political system. The Hong Kong failure basically demolished that myth. So this basically marks the end of the one country, two systems formula. So it has virtually zero appeal to the Taiwanese anymore. And we in the United States should also take that into consideration and readjust our policy toward Taiwan as well. because ultimately the United States and China reached agreement in 1972. That is, all disputes between people of Taiwan and China must to be resolved through peaceful means. And United States pledged defense support for the people of Taiwan based upon the threat level toward Taiwan posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Those two principles still remain the same. So I think it is about time for the United States to readjust its policy toward Taiwan altogether. And this is something that we try to do toward the end of the Trump administration, and President Trump gave us green light, and the Secretary of State Pompeo led the way, and he did a great job in redefining our policy toward Hong Kong and toward Taiwan. Of course, the Hong Kong policy was very clear. When China basically took over Hong Kong, we get rid of Hong Kong's special status. We sanctioned many Chinese officials as well as Hong Kong officials responsible for the crackdown on pro-democracy movements. And that's basically what's going on in Hong Kong and Taiwan. It's kind of, a sad story, but it also gives us a new hope for a brighter future for Taiwan and for the entire Chinese diaspora, I might say.
I'm interested in your talking about hope, because a lot of folks would look at the situation in Hong Kong and conclude that the CCP is determined to move forward. And if we just actually look into that debate over the U.S. relationship with Taiwan, it's unclear that on a truly deeper level, if it came down to it, there would be a willingness to spend blood and treasure to defend that relationship in the wake of everything. So I'm just curious why you're optimistic.
First of all, I think it would be a mistake for the PRC to really venture into some kind of a military confrontation with Taiwan and with the United States. Despite all the hot air that China is releasing on a daily basis with regard to Taiwan, the U.S. and its allies still hold substantial edge over the Chinese militarily. And also, we have sold the Taiwanese incredible amount of weapons that can substantially deter the Chinese aggression. So I will also say about the Chinese bluff. We have to, when we're dealing with China, we also have to understand, on one hand, this regime is very strong and powerful. On the other hand, it's also very fragile and weak, because it's a system built on high pressure, built on incredible amount of mendacity. So one tiny crack in the system is going to have an avalanche effect. So that's why when they're talking about the red line with regard to Taiwan, and a lot of times it's just bluff. I'll give you one example. 3 years ago, it would be unimaginable for the United States military to send its warship passing through Taiwan Strait without pissing off the Chinese government, because they say you must not do that. And if you have to do it, you have to get our permission. Of course, the permission will never be given, because Taiwan Strait is international water. It's a 100-mile narrow strait, very dangerous. China installed a whole bunch of missiles on one side and targeting Taiwan. We saw that red line and we ignored it because we pledged we're going to do whatever international laws allow us to do. So we sent warships through. We not only sent once, I think we sent probably over 40 times throughout the Trump administration. And we essentially internationalized the Taiwan Strait. That provides the best defense for Taiwan. Once we did it, our allies, including Japan, Germany, France, England, Canada, They all send their warships go through that. And so that's the red line. China insists we have to listen. And I think we ignore that, and we realize it's probably a good time for us to give China red lines. And this is something you can do, this is something you cannot do, all based on international law. We did the same thing to South China Sea, not as vigorous as we did to Taiwan Strait, but we're gaining international momentum. You have read, in recent weeks, our European allies, including Germany, UK, or France, they all committed to sending their naval assets to the South China Sea and to join the Quad, for example. The Indians were very active there, Japanese, obviously. So because South China Sea is international commons, doesn't belong to one particular country. We have to follow international law. That's our resolve, and I think that's our red line.
Miles, I'm also taken by the optimism that you expressed, because I have to say that I've never been less optimistic about the United States than I am today. Some mornings I wake up optimistic and then go to bed pessimistic. Some days I'm pessimistic all day long. Here are a couple of things that I see as changes, things that I'm totally unfamiliar with, and I'd like to get your reaction. One is just a general lack of belief in ourselves and our society. I don't even, I was a kid during the 70s, so maybe my perceptions of what was going on then aren't accurate. But I don't feel like there was a kind of malaise of this depth. I don't think that anyone in the 70s ever felt that the United States shouldn't prevail, didn't have the right to prevail over its adversaries. I'm not sure that today there's the same kind of belief in our system. But then secondly, I said in an earlier episode of this podcast, I recently learned about a major American business. I can't say the name, but they went, their top executives went to China, and the Chinese offered them a very blunt deal. They were very blunt with them, and they said, "We're going to open up our market to you for 4 years," I think it was, maybe 5, and then at the end of that time, we're going to take all of your all of what you have by way of proprietary knowledge becomes ours. And the business took that deal, and this is recently. So after we know all that we know about China, they took that deal because the executives themselves were going to be enriched, and because they felt that their responsibility was really to their shareholders in the short term, and this as a short-term deal made a lot of sense. As a long-term deal, they're possibly undermining the long-term viability of their own company. And it's that kind of thing when I see our business class get so deeply in bed with China, when I get to see the NBA getting deeply in bed with China, when I see major public figures making excuses for the genocide of the Uyghurs or playing it down, I lose confidence in us. So I'm curious about how you see that, both as an analyst, but both as an immigrant from China to the United States, somebody who came here with a great belief in our system.
The prevailing defeatism on part of many of our American citizens is completely unwarranted, because that defeatism is based upon lack of comparative framework. As you mentioned, that I'm an immigrant to this country. I lived through 2 systems, and I know the virtues and pros and cons of 2 systems. I can guarantee you the American system is far superior to any system that I have experienced. It allows immigrants like myself to prosper and to express, to fully release my potential, and to offer me all kinds of opportunities that otherwise would have been denied to me if I still live in China. So, but most importantly, I think if you are an American, you have the constitutionally guaranteed right to do a lot of things. In China, state controls everything. Rights was only at the expense disposal of the state. Government wants to give you some right, you enjoy some, but mostly it doesn't give you much rights. So I would also say, because of the kind of freedom, democracy, and vox populi of this country, it makes this country very, very strong. And we have hiccups here and there, but overall, the ingenuity, the Americans' creative urge, the sort of enterprising spirit, and our political resiliency, our ability to bounce back to higher ground is absolutely astonishing. And look at our military might. Look at our economy. Keep in mind, our economy is still number one. We account for about a quarter of the entire global GDP. And also, look at the achievement in science, technology, and in higher education. We're the envy of the world in most aspects of daily existence. So it is absolutely astonishing to me that many of my fellow Americans feel so bad about their own country. We have a lot of problems, as demonstrated in the last year or so, but our virtues far outweighed our vices. So I would say that's where my optimism comes in, and also if you ask average Chinese there, I mean, they admire American system. I mean, look at how many people want to. One of the hardest things to do for the average citizen in China is to get a visa to the United States. Everyone wants to come here. So that's become a cliche, but it's true. It still holds true. American system is dynamic. We change leaders every 4 years, every 8 years. At least we don't have a long-lasting system of either party. And if half of people agree with one party, another half will still have a chance a little bit later. So that gives the Americans tremendous space to argue, to weigh their political choices. So what's really is amazing, is worrisome to me, is that in the last couple of years also, I became kind of concerned because we are getting rid of some of our own very treasured strength that traditionally has made Americans strong, like the cancel culture, for example, like the demand for unanimity in opinion in public space. Those things are very, very worrisome, but I'm very sure and I'm confident that those are temporary phenomenon. Americans, if you look at study U.S. history, is always back and forth. Nothing is there too long because we have this wonderful, wonderful medium. Because some of the constitutional philosophies, some of the founding principles of this country were absolutely rock solid. Everybody endorses.
I think that is excellent to end on a note of confidence. Miles, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the work you've done in the past few years, and we're really excited to work with you at Hudson.
My pleasure, and I'm very excited to be able to work with so many wonderful colleagues at Hudson, and goodbye.
All right, goodbye. Thanks a lot, Miles.
Hope you all enjoyed the episode. As always, if you'd like to learn more, you can go to www.hudson.org to learn more about Dr. Yu's work, learn more about this podcast, and learn more about Hudson's policy portfolio as we seek to approach the issues we discuss every single week on this podcast. If you haven't already, please share, subscribe, and rate the podcast. We'd really appreciate it. It helps us do our work and perform even better. Huge thank you to Hudson again, of course. We'll see you all next week.